Good day. In this, I'm gonna try to make a comparison between the types of interviews you can expect from FANG companies. Again, I'm gonna go through each of these companies and even compare how these interviews can differ, and talk about my experiences with people who either went in these companies or trying to transition from these businesses, because I also think those are valuable reference points. All right, so the first one, the Facebook or Meta, would be a place where behavioral interviews are relatively new. Okay, this is when compared to companies, places such as Amazon, who pioneered, behavioral interviews a long time ago. Facebook is relatively newer to this field, and still, they do have a set of core values at Meta, which they link with how they interview people, especially in those non-technical screenings, right? Also, in my experience, Meta, this varies by role, but Meta is closer to 50-50% technical versus behavioral composition of their job interviews, when compared to other companies such as NVIDIA, which is far more technical, or balanced far more over the technical side of things than Meta, right? But again, it's the situation varies greatly, by the role that you're applying for, because if you're applying for a technical PM, you can certainly expect at least 50% technical types of questions, but at NVIDIA you would expect at least 75% technical questions, right? Other than that, non-technical interviews at Facebook tend to be quite similar to the ones at Google in terms of types of questions getting asked. Don't forget, Meta score values will be also a great starting point. I also made videos about the most commonly asked questions in Meta's interviews. I even have training programs for this if you want to check them out. But long story short, expect super down-to-earth, smart interviewers with these companies, and the type of people who might help transition from Meta to other places were also, really smart, and also had a story bank and prepared their job. Some of these people, I've worked with them for over 7 years now. Right, Amazon would be the second. So as I said in the beginning of the video, Amazon pioneered non-technical or behavioral interviews, or generalized them even for software engineering roles, simply because they saw value in people being able to do well behaviorally to drive success in their overall business. Right? Keep in mind, I helped, let's say, hundreds of people getting to Amazon through my paid services, and thousands, if not tens of thousands of people through my YouTube videos. So I'm quite knowledgeable with interviews with Amazon. They have a very specific, a unique, so to speak, process based on their leadership principles. Those leadership principles grew from 10, then to 12, then to 14, now they're 16. So you can imagine the process becomes more elaborate. Amazon is continuously finding new ways, new questions for those leadership principles. Everyone seems to be an expert these days on those leadership principles, but in my experience, it's not the experts in the leadership principles that pass these interviews. What I would suggest here is to, to reason from the first principles if you want, to exhibit the behaviors that you want to communicate very well, and don't forget about the principles, but keep in mind what you're good at and focus on interviewing on your strengths. Right, so as you can expect, if Amazon has 16 leadership principles and Meta has, maybe 6 or 8 core values, you can imagine that Amazon's interviews or behavioral interviews are more elaborate, and their model for behavioral competencies is far more complex. Right, now maybe a quick story I can share with you about Amazon. I once had, as a coaching customer, someone who used to lead the bar raiser program at Amazon. This lady who was trying to transition into, I think it was with Apple, yes, and she told me then, I I know those leadership principles at Amazon from you, from your YouTube channel. However, this was after I joined Amazon. So the leader of the Amazon Bar Raiser program did not prepare on the leadership principles to pass their Amazon interviews. Okay, it was on short notice, but still, she didn't put those leadership principles at the core, at how she prepared that job interview. And by the way, she was also, I think she had Google on her CV as well, right? Which I'll get on next. But long story short, Amazon is the ones who pioneered behavioral interviews, so you can expect a quality interview, a very specific interview based on the leadership principles, but at the end of the day, it's still your story bank that will make or break the process, so to speak. Right? And when compared to Amazon versus Meta, you can expect it's a lot simpler, more straightforward, so to speak, when compared to Amazon, which is more thorough and more organized as a process, right? Number 3, Netflix here. Netflix has some incredibly well-paying jobs. This is what struck me the most. I recently helped someone for a director level role. He gets well over $500,000 per year in salary, right? So I believe this is the main thing you should keep in mind. So keeping in mind that you have a great salary, expecting you there, you could also expect a pretty high quality interview process, right? I'm not sure if I don't think Netflix uses 30-minute interviews for any types of roles, especially for more junior types of roles, but they use those 30-minute interviews quite extensively with director level roles. Apparently, they also have those panel interviews, even face-to-face if possible these days. So the process is unique to Netflix. Okay, Netflix also have their famous culture deck. I think it's in their second, if not more, second version nowadays. They invested a ton into that process, similar in the same way that Amazon invested a lot in their leadership principles, and they're evolving those leadership principles. Netflix built their culture deck, and I think they kept the culture deck private for the first 2 years, and only then made it public in the first version. Then they modeled. So again, it's always a work in progress with the culture deck. But the reason why I'm mentioning is because they apparently do ask questions linked to sections of that culture deck. So it is part of the hiring process. So they do have some sort of model of behavioral competencies, similarly as Amazon does, and likely also Meta does, right? So my experience, so Netflix versus Amazon, while Amazon's interviews are the same for each and every candidate for that given role. They have the same questions, same follow-ups, same challenge questions. I highly doubt Netflix interviews are the same. In other words, yes, maybe they have a few questions they might want to ask all candidates, which they plan in advance, but nobody's going to check you if you did or didn't. And I don't think at Netflix it's a mandatory thing to take notes of what the candidate says and then to have the panel to decide whether your notes were valuable and what were you expecting from that candidate. So Netflix interview process is a bit more scrappy, so to speak, but not in a bad way. Remember what I said, the salary expectations are incredible there, and therefore you can expect some high quality interviews. Okay, my experience, the latest one was with someone coming from Google who was impacted by a layoff at Google and who landed a job at Netflix in LA it was. And the thing what I wanted to share with you is that they, in spite of the fact they interviewed pretty well, and I'm going to get to this next when I'm talking about Google interviews, they still take the time to prepare the job interviews, regardless of the fact they were applying for a director level role. And not to my surprise, but probably to your surprise, even though they were interviewing at Netflix, they had a job offer prepared for just in case they couldn't land a job offer at Netflix. So Netflix was, this would be exceptional if I could get a job with Netflix. Okay, so people, do get jobs in high-paying jobs these days as well, but people also do have backup these days too. So when you're hearing stories such as there's no jobs available, that's not my experience with the people I work with. So people I work with, most of them who interview for FANG roles also have some backup or are currently employed, So they don't go all or nothing. This doesn't work, right? So Netflix versus Amazon. Amazons are much longer. They have those leadership principles. Netflix does have their culture deck, but it's much simpler, much more to the point. Those 30-minute interviews. Not sure how often they use that for more junior types of roles, but it seems like it's enough time to screen someone, even for director level role in 30 minutes, right? So Netflix versus Meta, other than the 30-minute interviews and the panel interviews, I don't think there's much difference in the types of questions you can expect at Netflix versus Meta. So in other words, I would expect the same thing because they both have, Meta has their core values and Netflix has the culture deck. So they still have models of behavioral competences, pretty much the same thing. Now, expectations again. Look at the salary. If the salary is double at Netflix when compared to another company, then you can expect, the type of answers who will score well will be different. Okay, so you must, perform significantly better for Netflix interviews, but in terms of substance, I believe they're basically the same thing, right? Now, Google, I want to talk about Google's interviews because I also have pretty good experiences there as well. What you should understand at Google is that they also invested a lot into understanding how high-performing teams work and into human resources, so to speak, into human resources to understand what drives highly successful teams. Not all of their endeavors were successful. They also were one of the pioneers of structured hiring processes. They even sold an applicant tracking system, Google Hire, for some time. At the time, that was right after I quit my own applicant tracking system business. But Google is very knowledgeable of how interviews work and what is important for them to screen in candidates. Okay. This being said, Google is the only company in the traditional FANG lineup that do not have a model. In my opinion, they don't have a model of behavioral competencies to screen candidates on. Like Amazon has the leadership principle, Netflix has the culture deck, Meta has their core values. Google does not employ such a technique. Furthermore, I'm not sure if it's still the case, but I think it is. On their website, the way they advise you to prepare your job interview on the non-technical, on the behavioral side, would be to Google for the most commonly asked interview questions. And I believe this is super important. You understand why they employ such an approach of advising you to Google the most commonly asked questions. And that's simply because in Google's best interest is when a candidate is a high-performing candidate and they don't need to interview too well. Okay, so if you're a software engineer, you're a genius in software engineering, right? So long you're not a toxic person, Google will be happy to hire you, even if you cannot interview really well. If you're a genius, software engineer or director, whatever you want, and you interview well, the difference will be that when you interview with Google, you will ask them for a lot more money for what you can do. Okay, so this brings me back to my Google's advice to prepare the most commonly asked interview questions, and you're pretty much good to go. So it's not in your employer's interest that you're really good with non-technical interviews and you're good with interviewing. And this is one of the things that you should really pay close attention to when reading through the lines of hiring advice that many of these companies give you, because these are the best companies in the world. It doesn't get better than that, So these are the most qualitative hiring processes as well, maybe except some small businesses who prefer, to have, again, very elaborate process to interview with the CEO and so on and so forth. But they're really high quality and they know very well what to look for in the perfect candidate. It's not as if they could not afford hiring people, but they don't want to pay too much if you know how to sell yourself too well, right? Now, so Google versus Amazon. Google, I said they don't have, in my opinion, they don't use a model of behavioral competencies. I don't know what's inside Google, while Amazon does use their leadership principles quite extensively. Now, this being said, it's not as if Google won't ask you behavioral questions. They do ask them quite a lot, but not as structured as Amazon does, right? The Googliness test is more of a cultural fit screening, while at Amazon is far more structured, and there's far more research put into this process, and they're more serious about this, right? Google versus Meta or Google versus Netflix. I find Google, this is the same comparison. I find that, they're pretty much the same thing. Okay, so you shouldn't expect much of a different process. You shouldn't have different expectations if you're interviewing with Google versus Meta versus Netflix, except when compared to the salary expectations. If the salary is different, then you can expect the quality of the interview to be different. But in terms of substance, of the types of questions you'll get asked, it's pretty much the same thing, right? And the other thing, super important thing I want to say with respect to Google, I as of recently, I'm coaching more and more ex-Googlers. For various reasons, they were impacted by layoffs, they changed jobs and so on and so forth. But in my experience, as of recently, the best candidates I work with are ex-Googlers. And I would have never expected this simply because it didn't seem like Google put a lot of emphasis on behavioral interviewing skills. And I suspect, and I'm pretty confident, that the reason why these ex-Googlers are super good with interviews and with behavioral interviews specifically is because they receive a lot of on-the-job training with these things, right? So something you should keep in mind is that some of these companies offer great training for people who want to develop their interviewing skills and their soft skills, so to speak. Being able to handle conflict efficiently is something that you must have if you want to work into any high-performing companies, right? So even though Google doesn't put a lot of emphasis, they do train people for such things. They do train quite extensively. And I have some very good experiences with coaching ex-Googlers, right? So maybe a few honorable mentions here. NVIDIA tends to be slightly more technical, but I suspect that this is because they're early on in defining their model of behavioral competencies, so to speak. Even though NVIDIA might have a model of behavioral competencies, my experience was that if you do well in job interviews with any of these FANGs, you will also very likely do well in job interviews with NVIDIA, and the same thing goes with Microsoft, right? So just as a bottom line here, while companies might vary in branding overall and emphasis, a strong behavioral performance can help you both for getting hired, because truth be said, behavioral interviewing skills can compensate lack of subject matter expertise, right? Not a ton of it, but they can compensate. And, the most interesting scenario for behavioral interviewing skills would be to maximizing your offer, which is not something to underestimate. Especially, it's a total different story if you barely make it into any FANG role, or if you make it, and you maximize your offer. It's not only about the money, but it's also about how you will be regarded after you join them. So hopefully I give you some useful insight. Thank you very much for watching.